Julian Reed had mastered the art of control. In boardrooms and skyscrapers, his presence alone demanded silence. But nothing unnerved him more than the idea of returning to his family's country estate. Not because of the mansion or its memories, but the questions. Are you dating anyone? Were you settling down? They came with wine and polite smiles, but pierced deeper than criticism in a shareholders' meeting. To Julian, appearances were everything. Not for vanity, but for armor. Each calculated move in his life was a chess piece protecting the king of his reputation. He'd seen what vulnerability cost men in his position. Whispers, headlines, and worse, pity. That's why this weekend wasn't about emotions. It was business. And like any high-stakes negotiation, he was prepared to play the part flawlessly. So when he hired Eliza, he didn't want charm. He wanted credibility. Someone poised, polished, and convincingly affectionate enough to keep prying eyes satisfied. She wasn't just an actress. She was the missing puzzle piece to complete his illusion. No risks, no feelings. Just a clean, well-rehearsed act. At least, that's how it started. The plan was simple. Arrive with Eliza, smile for photos, nod through conversations, and leave with his image intact. Julian treated it like any other contract. Clear terms, solid boundaries. But life, especially the kind that later becomes an emotional story, doesn't always follow business plans. Sometimes it finds cracks in the most fortified walls. He remembered rehearsing their backstory over espresso in his penthouse. How they met, how they fell in love, why she adored his terrible cooking. Eliza played along effortlessly, sprinkling humor between lines, tilting her head in that way that made strangers believe in fairy tales. For a man who thought he'd seen it all, her natural warmth disarmed him. Julian wasn't one to believe in signs or fate, but the way Eliza adapted, improvised, and even laughed like she meant it, well, it stirred something unfamiliar. A flicker, not of love, surely, but of curiosity. Could someone fake affection that convincingly, without letting a little truth slip through? That question began echoing louder than he expected. And just like that, a script written to fool others started fooling him too. In between rehearsals, in silent car rides, in the way she adjusted his collar before stepping out, there was a softness that didn't feel rehearsed. A strange thought crossed his mind. What if this fake beginning was the doorway to something unexpectedly real? But of course, they hadn't even arrived at the family estate yet. From the moment they stepped into the estate, Eliza wasn't just believable, she was magnetic. She greeted Julian's relatives with elegance, weaving small talk like silk, and complimented his grandmother's brooch like it was priceless. Julian watched from the sidelines, amused at first. But amusement gave way to something more unsettling: admiration. This wasn't the act of someone pretending. It was something warmer. At dinner, she slid her hand into his under the table, a move they'd rehearsed, but this time he felt it linger. Her thumb traced lazy circles on his palm as she laughed at his uncle's tired jokes. Julian wasn't supposed to notice things like that, but now he couldn't stop noticing. The way she tilted her glass, the sparkle in her eyes, the stories she told that didn't sound rehearsed anymore. He found himself smiling more than usual, his shoulders lighter, his voice less guarded. It was ridiculous. The whole weekend was a charade. And yet, sitting beside Eliza, watching her talk to his cousin like they'd known each other for years, Julian felt oddly at home. The kind of feeling that doesn't come from logic. The kind that sneaks in through the side door of the heart. Eliza, too, started asking him things beyond the script. Not about his fake favorite band or the made-up vacation in Tuscany, but about his childhood. His real dog, Max. The last time he cried. Those questions shouldn't have mattered, but they did, and the answers came out softer than he intended. He noticed her watching him when he wasn't looking. She didn't flinch when he snapped at the staff or fumbled over a toast. Instead, she steadied him gently, subtly. A nod here, a squeeze of the arm there. Julian wasn't used to being supported without strings. This wasn't what he paid for, but it was everything he didn't know he needed. And it wasn't just Julian who noticed. Even his skeptical sister, who could sniff out a lie before dessert, pulled him aside and whispered, "She really loves you, doesn't she?" He didn't know what to say. The line between performance and reality was blurring, not with flash or drama, but with a quiet, persistent tenderness, the kind that builds slowly in a real story. But for all the emotions brewing under the surface, neither of them dared to speak it out loud. Not yet, because there was still one person in the house who saw beyond the charm, beyond the roles. Someone who had lived long enough to recognize when something familiar was hiding in plain sight. George Reed had always been the quiet observer in a room full of noise. As Julian's grandfather, he'd lived long enough to know that people wore masks, some out of necessity, others out of fear. But when Eliza walked through the door, something in him stirred. Not suspicion, not awe, recognition. He couldn't place it immediately, but her voice tugged at a part of his memory that hadn't stirred in decades. Not the mind, the heart. He watched her closely, not with judgment, but with curiosity lined by something softer. Her gestures, her laugh, even the way she adjusted her posture when listening, they all felt hauntingly familiar. Not like déjà vu, but like watching a movie you once lived in, just from another angle. Julian thought the performance was flawless. George thought it was familiar, and that difference was the seed of a touching story's twist no one saw coming. After dinner, while the others debated politics and wine, George pulled Julian aside under the pergola. The stars above them flickered like whispers of forgotten truths. "Where's she from?" he asked casually, though his eyes told another story. Julian, unaware of the meaning behind the question, answered simply. Eliza was from the South, grew up with her grandmother. That word, grandmother, stopped George cold. George excused himself and wandered back to his study, a room untouched by time. He pulled out an old box of letters, photographs, and yellowing notes tied with faded ribbon. There among the memories was the photo that took the breath from his lungs, Margaret. His Margaret, the woman who'd left him with questions that had never been answered. And now, Eliza mirrored her like an echo returned after half a lifetime. His hands trembled as he traced the edges of the photo, piecing together emotions like a detective. Could it be? The shape of her eyes, the cadence of her laughter. These weren't coincidences. They were inherited traits. The real story was unraveling in his chest, and it wasn't fiction. It was blood and memory and maybe even fate. Still, he didn't want to scare anyone with assumptions. Not yet. So George watched. During breakfast, in the garden, at the piano, he asked Eliza gentle questions about her family, her roots, her grandmother, and when she mentioned Margaret, a literature student from the South who had passed years ago, he didn't blink. He simply nodded and smiled. But inside, everything shifted. His past wasn't a closed book. It was reopening with new chapters. And yet, he didn't tell Julian. Not yet. Because he knew, when the heart senses something profound, it needs space to breathe before words can make sense of it. George just needed a little more time. Because if what he suspected was true, this wasn't just a romantic illusion. This was the intersection of love, legacy, and something far deeper than either of them expected. The study became George's sanctuary that night, dimly lit and thick with memories. He stared at the photo of Margaret as if it were speaking back to him, confirming what his heart already knew. Her eyes, Eliza's eyes, were identical. There was a softness in both, a hidden strength that didn't beg for attention but demanded to be felt. These weren't mere similarities. They were reflections passed through generations. He joined Eliza in the sunroom the next day, asking about her childhood with casual curiosity. She answered openly, sipping her tea, unaware that every word was stitching together pieces of George's past. My grandmother loved poetry, she smiled. She studied literature in Georgia. Her name was Margaret, and in that moment, the emotional story became more than coincidence. It became a bridge across decades. George's hands curled around his cane as if grounding himself. He didn't say anything right away. How do you tell someone they carry the soul of a love you lost? So he asked more questions, not invasive, just intentional. And Eliza answered them, all with the warmth of someone who had no idea she was standing in the middle of someone else's unfinished chapter. That evening, he took the photo to Julian. He didn't present it like evidence. He just laid it on the table between sips of scotch and let the silence do the talking. Julian looked at the woman in the picture, then at Eliza playing cards with his cousins in the other room. "She looks just like her," George finally said. "Margaret. She was the one who got away." Julian furrowed his brow, skeptical at first. To him, this had all started as a performance, not a real story, not some deeply woven connection. But George's voice cracked with emotion, and suddenly the idea didn't seem so absurd. Maybe life was stranger than fiction. Maybe Eliza was more than the perfect actress. Maybe she belonged here for reasons neither of them had fully understood yet. Eliza, meanwhile, sensed a subtle shift. Julian was quieter, more reflective. George was more present, always smiling when she entered a room. She chalked it up to her acting, her ability to blend in. But something about their energy told her there was more going on. Like whispers traveling through time, brushing past her skin without a sound. There was a story unfolding, and she didn't even know she was in the middle of it. And still, no one said a word. Not yet, because the truth, once spoken, would change everything. Until then, it lingered like music playing softly in the background, unnoticed by some, unforgettable to others. And that music was growing louder with each passing hour, pulling them all toward a revelation none of them were ready for. Julian started noticing it during lunch. The way George looked at Eliza wasn't casual anymore. It was tender, almost reverent, like watching someone relive a melody from long ago. Eliza wasn't just impressing his grandfather. She was awakening something in him. That realization made Julian feel strangely protective. Not of the lie they were living, but of the truth that might be hiding underneath. Eliza had sensed the tension too, but in a different way. She wasn't used to roles lingering after the curtain closed. Yet this one clung to her skin. Her laughter didn't feel staged anymore. Her glances toward Julian weren't timed. And every time George asked about her family, she felt a growing need to be honest, even if she didn't fully understand why. In a quiet moment by the fireplace, Julian asked, "Do you ever feel like this isn't pretend anymore?" Eliza looked at him, not with surprise, but with a softness that said, "I've felt it for a while." The line between actor and person was gone. What remained was something unspoken, but undeniable. And maybe, just maybe, it was more important than the original plan. George finally couldn't hold back. He invited Julian for a walk, the kind of walk that usually ended in fatherly advice. But this time, it was a confession. "She's Margaret's granddaughter," he said, holding the photograph like proof of a miracle. Julian stood in stunned silence. What began as a staged romantic weekend had now tangled itself with real flesh and blood history. An emotional story too layered to make up. It all started making sense. The warmth in George's voice. The way Eliza looked so at ease, even in unfamiliar places. Julian felt like a man waking up in a dream that someone else began writing long ago. It wasn't just fate. It was legacy wrapped in coincidence, sealed with timing. And he wasn't sure whether to run from it or lean into it completely. Meanwhile, Eliza could feel something slipping, not in a bad way, but in a revealing one. Julian was quieter. George was gentler. She felt seen, not as a character in someone else's tale, but as herself. The walls of pretense were falling, and in their place stood something raw, unfiltered, and achingly human. She had come to play a role, but the truth had cast her in a much larger story. And that story was now standing at a crossroads. Because the question wasn't whether they were still pretending, it was how much of their hearts had already stepped into something real. And if this entire weekend had been scripted, well, someone forgot to write an ending. Because the way things were going, they were all being carried into the next scene by something none of them could control. The final evening arrived like a scene waiting for its climax. The dining room glowed with soft candlelight, and the air held that bittersweet weight, like the last page of a beautiful book you don't want to close. George stood at the head of the table, raising a glass. But his toast wasn't about birthdays or tradition. It was a quiet tribute to love that stretches across generations, the kind that never really dies. He spoke in metaphors, weaving a tale of a girl he once knew and a feeling he never forgot. His voice cracked slightly, but he smiled through it, glancing at Eliza with a reverence only the past can explain. No one knew exactly what he meant, but Julian did. And Eliza, she felt something settle in her chest, like a puzzle piece finding its place. The emotional story was no longer a performance. It was real, and it was hers too. Later that night, away from the crowd, Julian found her in the garden. The moonlight painted silver across her skin as she turned to face him. "I wasn't supposed to feel anything," he admitted. "This was just for show." But his voice wavered. "Then you show me something I forgot existed." Eliza didn't speak. She just stepped closer, and for the first time there was no script. Only breath, heartbeat, and truth. She had been pretending too. Pretending she was fine with temporary. Pretending this was just a job. But every moment with Julian had etched itself into her. And the way George looked at her, the way the past echoed through her name, it all made her feel like she was part of something bigger. Not just a romance. A real story with roots, weight, and meaning that stretched beyond her own life. Julian touched her hand, then her cheek. "I don't want this to end with the weekend," he said. And in that moment, Eliza didn't hesitate. Then let's not let it. It wasn't about contracts or appearances anymore. It was about a man rediscovering love and a woman discovering where she belonged. Not in fantasy, but in a truth so raw it felt like fiction. The kind of truth that only touching stories are made of. George, watching from the window, let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Love hadn't just come full circle. It had healed something inside him, something that had stayed unanswered for decades. And now, through the two of them, it lived again. Not in memory, but in motion. In something honest. In something earned. And though the weekend would end, what had begun between them wouldn't. Because some beginnings disguise themselves as endings. And some meetings, the ones you least expect, are written long before you even realize you're part of the story. So tell me, do you think it was just coincidence? Or is there something bigger guiding the steps we take? Even the fake ones? Have you ever experienced a moment that felt scripted by fate, like you were walking into someone else's unfinished story? What would you do if a lie you told for protection ended up revealing a truth you didn't even know you were missing? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Was this love, destiny, or just a perfectly timed accident? Drop your theory in the comments. Do you believe in legacy love stories like this? Or do you think it was all just clever acting that got too real? And hey, if this emotional story touched you even a little, if it made you think of your own connections, your own what-ifs, then don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe in real love again, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next touching stories we'll bring to life. Because sometimes, the most unforgettable stories are the ones we almost didn't tell.